What is happening out there, Roto Scouts football fans? Welcome to the show, gang. A little Thursday night football action. Forgive the voice, it's been going in and out. It sounds like it's okay right now. But I was hanging out last night and just chatting and noticed I was a little scratchy voice, like I'd been talking a ton about baseball that day or something. But it was weird. Hadn't come out of shows or anything, typically come out fine. And was a little bit hoarse last night, but sounds like I'm all right today. Don't do much talking other than like to the pets throughout the afternoon. So who knows? You never know with these things. But should be a good Thursday night football slate to talk through. A lot of options on this one. Both teams kind of long-ish depth charts for our showdown purposes, where there's a couple guys on both sides that are going to get a couple of snaps, run a couple of routes, might connect for that big dart throw touchdown for us. So there's a lot to talk through. Overall, interesting total in Vegas. 6-point spread, 44.5, with both teams playing really slow paces. I don't know that we get to that 44.5 total. I kind of like the under overall. The under overall, that's a hell of a way to put that. I kind of like the idea of the under. Just given the slow pace, it's the fourth and fifth, I think, slowest neutral pace. So I'm not expecting a ton of fireworks in this one. But I think we've got some interesting options, and neither defense is all that good. So I think there's definitely potential. I think a lot of it rides on how these two quarterbacks play. So it should be an interesting one to talk through. Getting little pop-ups here. Let's see if there's any news coming through. I'm not expecting any news. Chase Claypool being out is the lone real important thing. Obviously has a little bit of an impact on that passing game. But doesn't seem like he's going to be a part of their team anymore, so we're kind of already prepared for that. Stephen Leibowitz says Justin Fields is his SP1. Took the over, no faith in the defenses. I have really no faith in the defenses, but I don't have all that much faith in the offenses either. I do think they're both okay. I think they can score. It really comes down to, again, the quarterbacks. So we'll see what happens, but looks like we can say hi to everybody. Stephen Leibowitz, obviously. We just talked to Stephen. What's going on, buddy? Aloysius is here. Kent Woodhouse is here. We've got Trey. What's up, Trey? Trey says, ladies and gentlemen, and I use those terms loosely. Tizzle here. Tiz was here 2 hours or so ago, hour and a half ago. Hit the like button back then. Not sure if Tiz is back yet, but thanks for hitting that like button. Pope is here. Pope says, let's win this money. Cujo's here. Cujo Blue says, time for someone in this community to get a big takedown. I couldn't agree more. Let's go win a big one. Del22 is here. All is well, buddy. Hope the same for you. Anthony Taylor. What's going on, Ant? Both QBs, yeah. I think both QBs are going to be an important part of lineups. Showdown slate, kind of, typical approach to have both quarterbacks in there in a lot of lineups. Either one of the quarterbacks with some correlated scoring, obviously, is going to be an important construction for a number of lineups. There's a lot of different ways to put this one together. Fanatic's here. What's up, Fanatic? So we can kind of just pull up the old spreadsheet here, dive on in. Projections basically up to date. We've got some, very thin down the depth chart guys like Jamison Crowder that I don't exactly expect to be involved. Carrie Blasingame, Travis Homer. So, as usual, anybody projected below a point, feel free to take out of your crunches, your lineup builds, whatever you want to call them. But there are guys who are going to be, they're limited by projections because they're limited by opportunity. But a couple of looks, a handful of routes run, really could make all the difference on a showdown slate. And there are guys like that on both of these teams. So for showdown usage, I do think it's interesting. There's a lot of interesting, value plays who'll be out there for a couple of touches, a couple of looks. There's a lot of, obviously, key receivers and key ball carriers on both sides. It's kind of clear cut between the actual starters, the actual, really relevant players, the guys that we know are going to be touching the ball a decent amount of the time. Less so when you get down depth chart a little bit. But I think it's an interesting game. Like I was saying, 44.5 point total feels slightly high for these two teams to me. Washington favored by 6. The best player on the field, or the best two players, are probably on the Chicago side. Justin Fields, DJ Moore. Do we get better than that? I mean, Brian Robinson, certainly a very good running back. Terry McLaurin versus DJ Moore, you could easily argue at wide receiver. But overall, Justin Fields probably, at least in terms of fantasy, the biggest ceiling, the best overall player on the field, most dynamic guy on the field. So it's kind of interesting with the way that Vegas is seeing this one. I think there's more room for Chicago to get in this game, keep it close, have an actual game where they're duking it out a little bit and we're not necessarily cresting all the way up to 44.5. Ideally, both quarterbacks are taking advantage of these weak defenses. Washington currently allowing 7 yards per pass attempt, 24th ranked. They're also giving up 4.5 yards per rush attempt, 26th ranked. So Washington not exactly going to be challenging Chicago on the ground or through the air. And then the Bears are currently 31st ranked out of 32 teams, giving up 8.4 yards per pass attempt. 10th ranked by yards per rush attempt at 3.8. But rush DVOA doesn't really like them. Rush defense DVOA doesn't rank them all that highly. So a little bit of a discrepancy there. Obviously, in my numbers here on this screen, we're just looking at the pure yards per rush attempt there. So they do rank out well for that, but they're giving up a fair amount of total yards per game. They're giving up some touchdowns. So I think there's opportunity galore across the skill players. The Commanders throw the ball a little bit more. I almost slipped up. Almost called them by the old name. They throw the ball a little bit more than the Bears do. The Bears run the ball a little bit more, but both teams are going to be pounding the ball on the ground with their key running backs. We got a little bit more clarity in the running game situation for Chicago. It's not as split as it was, so that's good news. The Washington rushing game has been very clear-cut from the get-go. Washington's got 3 starting wide receivers that are basically fairly capable, getting about 60% of the snaps. All see looks. On the Chicago side, it's more like 2 wide receivers, a good tight end, 1.5 wide receivers and a good tight end, depending on what you think of Darnell Mooney. And then some dart throws around the Equanimeous St. Browns, who ran a bunch of routes but only was targeted once last time out. The Tyler Scotts of the world, the Velus Joneses even of the world are at least oddly slightly on the board. So it's a weird one when we get down depth chart, like I was saying. I think it is a week where you can throw in your kickers for sure. Even possibly for some cheap captain plays, maybe. I do think it's a week where you want to get a little bit diverse at captain, but you can absolutely, we're talking DK when I get into the captain thing because of the multiplier. You can absolutely use both of these quarterbacks at captain, though. There's a pretty good range of outcomes where either one of the quarterbacks is going to put up a good enough score that you're going to want them in there. You typically would want some correlated scores along with them, but I don't necessarily think it's mandatory today, especially with Justin Fields. He could go out there and win this thing by himself. So I wouldn't mandate it. I would probably run like half my lineups with a rule that mandated it, then half of them not, and take what I get out of that. I definitely always want to have skill players in the captain spot in the preponderance of lineups, though, the majority of lineups. So I'm looking in DJ Moore's direction for sure. I'm looking in the direction of the primary receivers from the Washington side with Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. I imagine Dotson will be a little bit less expensive. But you've got guys who catch the ball on both sides down the depth chart in terms of like Antonio Gibson is going to be out there running a handful of routes. Logan Thomas is going to be involved at the tight end position on the Washington side, but some of the other guys might get a couple of looks too. Dimey Brown was out there running some routes. So there are ways to spread around some of these shares and create salary upside where you can get to combinations of the high end, high price skill players and still have your low end guys that are value plays as your dart throws. Larry says Dotson has to hit at some point. He's always high in air yard share, or that could be my bias. I drafted him in a bunch of best ball teams. I like Dotson. He projects out fairly well, and I agree. I think he's, at some point we're definitely going to hit there. So I'll keep running him back. He's seeing targets. He's seeing, what did he have? It was 4 for 9, only 27 yards last week, but scored the only touchdown. And he was targeted 4 times in the red zone last week. 3 times inside the 10, once inside the 5. Those were his only red zone targets all year. But Terry McLaurin is yet to be targeted in the red zone, which is kind of weird. So I do think there's opportunity there for Dotson. There's a lot of interesting ways to go with this one. Jake Swell says MLB wildcard round sure went quick. Yeah, really did. Wasn't expecting it to go quite like that, where we would have no slates, nothing to talk about. I was thinking maybe we'd have like a 2-gamer today, maybe a showdown tomorrow, but yeah. Quick work. Dennis is here. What's up, Den? Yeah, Curtis Samuel, sure. Trey, we'll get into that. We'll get into some of the questions. Trey saying St. Brown versus Scott, who sees more work. Judging by last week, Equinemius St. Brown was out there, ran 50% routes, but only saw one target on him. 1 for 1 for 21 yards. And Tyler Scott carried the ball 2 times for 19 yards in week 4, but saw 0 targets. 21.4% routes run per dropback overall for the season, but then that went down last week in favor of going to Equinemius St. Brown in the routes run, but neither one of them was going to get targets anyway. So it's just kind of weird. Scott is a 4th-round pick, so there's draft capital, which we always like to look for when making those kinds of decisions. And the fact that they weren't throwing the ball in St. Brown's direction, you kind of know what you've got in him. So I feel like it makes more sense to favor Tyler Scott there, but I think it's close, and I think they're both pretty thin. You've also got Velus Jones in there. He carried the ball once for 10 yards, 0 targets, ran 2 routes total last week, ran 2 routes in week 2, wasn't targeted. So he's another guy who's just, maybe going to touch the ball twice, maybe going to see a target. I don't think he's by any means a priority. He's the bottom of the board there. But he is a guy who could poach that weird, you're on the 5 and he gets that weird little look. Obviously, we're focused on primarily the DJ Moores, the Cole Kmets, the to a lesser extent Darnell Mooney. But even, if you want to get into even further down the board, Mercedes Lewis, he ran four routes last week. He was targeted once. He caught it for 8 yards. It's his only target all year. He only ran one other route. It was in week 3. He saw a few snaps each week. Didn't run any routes the first 2 weeks. But if he's going to be out on the field, the tight end position, it's a big guy. Happened to look his way in the red zone. Happened to come down with the ball. Sometimes that's all we need on these showdown slates. So those are the kind of weird-ass plays that I'm talking about here. But again, we're really... The bulk of our lineups are built around the quarterbacks, the higher projected running backs, the guys who are going to be touching the ball, and then you thread some of these low-end guys in. Both quarterbacks have opportunity to throw the ball against these defenses. 8.3 yards per pass attempt allowed so far by Chicago. Again, 31st in the league. 267 yards per game allowed. Already allowed 10 touchdowns through the air. Getting pressure 30% of the time on a 29.5% blitz rate, 12 sacks, picked off 2 passes so far. On the idea of getting to the quarterback a little bit, I do think that the Chicago D is potentially on the board if they keep the scoring in check. They could absolutely be involved in DFS scoring. It's not the greatest play in the world, given how bad they are against the pass, given that we do expect some scoring in this game overall. But if the thread does run toward the under, if we do end up with a little bit limited output by the middling skill players on in some of these spots, then I do think that either defense could come through. For Fields, they're giving up 6.4 yards per pass attempt, 230 a game. They've given up 6 touchdowns through the air already. What's most interesting is the 9.2 yard defensive ADOT. They are vulnerable downfield, and Fields has some okay weapons down the field, and his primary receiver is also his favorite downfield target, DJ Moore. So I think that's at least very interesting. DJ had 16.4 yards per reception last week. Caught 8 of 9 targets for 131 and a touchdown, 42% of the air yards. So I think just in the terms of throwing down the field and Washington being vulnerable to deep passing, it's an interesting spot. Fields obviously has the rushing upside. 7 carries a game, 134 yards, put it in the end zone once. Howell on the other side has rushing ability, ran the ball a handful of times last week. Last week he ran the ball, I want to say 4 times. 6 times. 6 times for 40 yards. That was where the 4 came from. Overall, last week, Fields had the big game, 28 of 35 for 335 yards, 4 touchdowns, threw an interception, had the big fumble loss, carried the ball just the 4 times for 25 yards, didn't score. Also, again, inexplicably no designed runs. It's just a weird decision from Chicago that they're not scheming for him to run the ball. He's running the ball anyway on a lot of plays, but a lot of it's more, escape running, scrambles, and broken plays and things like that, rather than him actually getting the play call and getting the blocking and everything. It's just a weird, when you've got a weapon like that, it's just weird. Howell, 4 touchdowns and 5 interceptions overall isn't ideal. 4 of those interceptions, though, came in one game against Buffalo. So you take it for what it's worth. Last week, 29 of 41, 290 yards, only threw 1 touchdown, but didn't throw any picks. And then he scrambled a little bit, ran the ball a little bit, 6 times for 40 yards, like I said. Overall, 30th in fantasy points per dropback, but he does throw the ball 35 times a game on average and was into the 40s last week. So that's kind of interesting. 6.9 yards per pass attempt for him, 7 for Justin Fields. Intended air yards, basically the same, 7.5, 7.6. 4.5 completed versus 4 for Justin Fields. But Fields, 7 touchdowns, 5 picks. Howell, only 4 touchdowns, 5 picks. This is where it's like, all right, I don't necessarily know that these two guys are going to march their teams up and down the field and fulfill that game total here. I don't necessarily know that these defenses are out of play, given how frequently these guys both like to throw the ball to the other team. So my enthusiasm about the crazy offensive upside of this game is a little bit tempered. Let's see what's going on in chat. Speaking of Metero's locking tight end up, and thank you. You're welcome, buddy. Yeah, Kmet, I think it's definitely a key spot in this game. He's obviously the second focal point in that passing game. 25% of the targets last week. He was targeted on 37.5% of the routes that he ran. 7 of 9 for 85 yards and caught the 2 touchdowns. 9.4 yards per target last week. He leads the team in red zone targets, which is always good. Washington is good against tight ends. So there's that. Least fantasy points to the tight end position so far this year. So there is that aspect of it. But a premium target in that offense and a guy that it seems like Fields likes to connect with in the red zone. Meathead asks anyone in the chat on FanDuel. I am, buddy. I play on FanDuel. That's the only place I play for the most part. Stephen Leibowitz doesn't mind not having baseball today. We'll pick it up on Saturday. Yeah, it gives us an opportunity to dig into this, and then tomorrow we'll do a main slate show, like a quarterbacks and stacks kind of a preview type show like we did last week on Friday. I'll have all the projections up tonight. I know I said yesterday it would be within the next 24 hours. Just didn't anticipate how much there would be to go through and change for this week. A lot of returning players, potentially a lot of questionable spots. So I've been working on it through the day. Also, I had a bunch of beers and kind of slept in. What are you going to do? So those will go up tonight. I'll get the content rolling. We'll do a little show tomorrow. And then we'll do our usual game by gamer on Saturday. Hopefully a little bit shorter. Only 10 games on the main slate this week. K. McGregor, what's up? K-Mac. K. McGregor says T. McB. I respond K-Mac with an exclamation point. Lone Wolf's here. What's up, buddy? One of these days, I'm going to get that soundboard, I swear. I want to be able to hit the wolf howling when Lone Wolf shows up. Matthew Patterson's playing 17% Robinson. Likes the Bears side. Rip Dick Butkus. Did Dick Butkus just die? Was he still... I didn't realize he was still alive. Can't remember the last time I saw him. Yep, dead at 80. Well, hell, there's something to play for. Is that a narrative now? Chicago going to go out there and win one for the Dicker? Larry says, can it be a little shorter on Saturday? I was fading and watched the last half on Sunday morning. Well, that's the beauty part. That's why it's on Saturday, so that you can still knock out a couple hours of it on Sunday morning. But yes, ideally, we wouldn't go quite so long. So let's dig in here on the ground a little bit. Do want to leave some time to build lineups and look at lineup builds in the little builder here. So, on the ground, both teams have capable backs. Khalil Herbert last week, 18 carries, 103 yards, was also 4 of 5 for 19 yards with a touchdown through the air. And most importantly, I think, 78% of the snaps versus only 22% for Rashawn Johnson. I think that's kind of key. Johnson, 5 carries for 13 yards, 1 of 1 receiving for 2 yards. Not really all that involved. So if they're kind of shifting the focus, just making it Herbert's game here, Johnson would definitely be on the board for our purposes for Showdown. But with the limited volume, I don't know how much you're looking to him at captain. Probably it becomes pretty touchdown dependent. As a mix-in at the flex position, you get a handful of points out of him. You're still probably fairly touchdown dependent because of the limited volume. But viable there for the cheap pricing. But Herbert's definitely the prime focus there. Projects out like it. 10.25 rush attempts per game. Hasn't scored on the ground yet. 49 yards per game, 4.8 yards per rush attempt. Johnson, 4.7 yards per rush attempt, does have a rushing touchdown. Also gaining 1.3 yards after contact, 3.4 yards before to Herbert's 2.8 yards before, 2 yards after. 1 target in the red zone so far for Herbert, 2 for Johnson. Johnson was getting 3 targets a game, but again, got much more limited, much more stark shares last week. Pope's here. Pope says, I think Samuel will take some of Dotson's ownership, and I think this will be somewhat of a slugfest, and only 2 to 3 options per team will be viable. Yeah, I mean, that's usually how it comes out, right, in the end with the NFL. Going in, we got to talk about the viability of all these guys, but coming out the other side, it always turns out, hey, only 2 or 3 of those guys were relevant to the scoring, because there's just, we've got limited time to work with, and we've got limited opportunity to work with. There's only going to be so many points scored, unless we're talking about the Dolphins against the Broncos, and then it's limitless. So I'm much more into the Khalil Herbert side in terms of what I want to get exposed to, but I will definitely allow some Rashawn Johnson into these lineups, and then neither one of these guys are going to touch the ball. They haven't been involved whatsoever. On the Washington side, it's definitely Brian Robinson's game. 55% of the snaps to 38% for Antonio Gibson last time out. But Gibson really not doing all that much. He's running routes on 50% of the team's dropbacks. There is that. He's involved in the passing game to a degree. But overall, he's seeing just 2.5 targets a game. Hasn't been targeted in the red zone. So I don't know exactly how valuable he actually is in the passing game, despite running routes on 50% of their dropbacks. Chicago has been a little bit vulnerable to receiving running backs, so there is that. Maybe he sees a little bit of uptick. Robinson, week 4, 14 carries for 45 yards, scored a touchdown. Had 19 carries in week 1, 18 carries in week 2, so the idea of volume beyond the 14 carries is certainly there. He was 2 for 2 for 6 yards in the air. Only 25% of the routes run per dropback, though. Antonio Gibson more involved in the passing game in terms of being out there running routes. And then Chris Rodriguez, been sick all week, limited in practice, doesn't really get involved anyway. He played week 1. He carried the ball 3 times for 7 yards. Hasn't touched the ball since. He was out in weeks 3 and 4. I do not expect much if he's even on the field. Even at the 200, 300, I don't think he's worth anybody's time here. So really, Blasingame, Homer, Rodriguez, I think you just take out of the player pool. Just focus on the guys with actual projections in the ground game here. But I do think like Antonio Gibson, given the 3,200, 4,800 pricing on DK, 7,500 on FanDuel, it's not an ideal price for him on FanDuel, but I think at the same price, I prefer him to Rashawn Johnson slightly, given that he's going to be out there running routes. Robinson, 92, 13, 8 versus Khalil Herbert at 86, 12, 9. Probably just given pricing, popularity, I think DFS-wise, that leans me a little bit in Herbert's direction. 11,000 versus 14,000 on the FanDuel slate. If I can get him cheaper, if I can get him with lower ownership, I kind of like that opportunity that creates. But it's really a four-man running game. These 2 guys and these 2 guys. Through the air, got a little bit more depth to work with. Who's Yeah, Claypool's been out. They told Claypool not even to show up. It's a team doesn't like him kind of a thing. Who was I'm not sure who you guys are responding to. Oh, Rodriguez is out. Okay. Don't play. We're not playing him anyway. Right? The whole take there was just, not to get involved with him anyway. But yeah, thank you for the thanks for confirming that. Claypool's in a timeout. Yeah, exactly. He's a talented guy. I mean, hopefully he gets traded somewhere. That said, do I want my Giants to pick him up to fill their really limited wide route room? I feel like he'd just be another guy similar to what they have already. But I don't know. Maybe it wouldn't be the worst move in the world. They can get him on the cheap, which I'm sure they can. Anyway, DJ Moore, 93% of the snaps, 94% on average, 4.75 catches a game on 20% of the targets, 6 targets a game. Oh, a stupid name with damn dots. Average depth of target for DJ, 13.7 yard ADOT. Pretty solid. Again, we're talking about the big downfield weapon for this team also being their most targeted receiver. 42% of the air yards. Last week he went 8 of 9 for 131 and a touchdown. Shared the big week with Fields. 16.4 yards per catch. Week 3 was only 3 of 6 for 41 yards, but also scored a touchdown that week. Week 2, 6 of 7 for 104, didn't score. But clearly the number one option in this offense, the number one downfield weapon against the team that's vulnerable down the field. Like that quite a bit. He's turning in 12.54 yards per target so far on 20% of their targets. He's had 2 looks in the red zone. Pretty solid option there. For $10,000, $15,000, you're paying a premium for him. But definitely a guy that I'm going to have in MVP spots on FanDuel. Definitely a guy I'm going to have in a bunch of lineups at 12-5 on the FanDuel slate. And highly playable at the captain position when we're looking for skill players at captain. Darnell Mooney, 75% of the snaps last week, 77% on average. Kind of arguable whether it's him or Cole Kmet that is the true number 2 here. Mooney only sees 11.4% of the targets. Excuse me, that was last week's number. Yeah, 11.4% of the targets last week with Claypool out. Overall, 10.3% of the targets, 4 per game. Cole Kmet, wherever he is, 20.7% of the targets, 6 per game. He's also gotten 2 touchdowns. He's been targeted in the red zone 3 times. To me, Cole Kmet is the clear number 2. Mooney's the number 3. And I think that's probably how the Bears will break it down as well. 9.6 yard ADOT for Mooney is second on the team in downfield targets, but DJ Moore is targeted down the field like 2/3 as many times. 3 times as many times, rather. So Moore's your main weapon in the passing game here, but Mooney's involved. Definitely going to be on the board for a few targets. If he comes up with that big touchdown, and if he comes up with a big downfield touchdown, more importantly, that could be a big difference maker when he costs half of what his counterpart does at the wide receiver position. $5,000, $7,500, that is a big discount from the number 1 wide receiver. $8,500 versus $12,500 on the FanDuel slate. Big discount. Obviously a big difference in projection, but not as big a difference in opportunity. 4 targets versus 6 targets, similarly down the field. Same offense, same quarterback, obviously. Kmet, again, same concept. Little bit cheaper than DJ Moore. Getting the same target share. Obviously not the downfield weapon that DJ Moore is, but in the red zone, that's who they're looking to. 6.8 yard ADOT, 20.7% of the targets, turning in 9.1 yards per catch, 7.8 yards per target, 3 targets in the red zone. Again, Washington good against the tight end position, the least fantasy points in the league allowed to the position so far over 4 weeks. Then going down the board, which is always going to be fun, we've got, let's knock out the tight ends first. Robert Tonyan ran 11 routes last week. His high for the season was the 9 routes that he ran in week 2. He's been targeted on he was targeted on 18.2% of the routes he ran, which amounted to 2 for 2 for 18 yards and no touchdowns in week 4. 2 targets in week 2, 2 targets last week. That's it. Not a premium option. Not going to be running all that many routes. But if you happen to get him on the right route in the red zone, gets the target, gets the catch for the touchdown, those are the kind of cheapo plays that can win showdown slates. Not one to go out there and put in 120 of 150 lineups, but to mix into a couple at 600 on DK in the flex, 6,000 on FanDuel in the flex, couple of targets. Sure. Mercedes, like I said, ran 4 routes, was targeted once last week. It was his only target all year. He only ran 1 other route all year, so he's run 5 routes all season. He's out there for 29% of the snaps, but he's really not that involved in the passing game. The targets are so limited that they don't even come up. He's got a negative 3-yard ADOT, apparently. So very, very, very limited touchdown-dependent option with Lewis. A little bit more to believe in, I think, for Robert Tonyan, but not that much. And then we get into the wideouts. We referred to it a little bit just a few minutes ago, but to dig back in, Tyler Scott, a 4th-round pick, seeing 19% of the snaps so far. 3.9% target share, 2 per game. Last week, with Claypool out, his routes run dropped. He wasn't targeted. He carried the ball twice, gained 19 yards, didn't do anything else. How many routes did he run? I didn't note the number of actual routes that he ran. Scott. There he is. I typed in Scott and somebody named Trent Scott from the other side popped up and I was, wait a minute. What's this guy's name? Where's last week? Ran 7 routes last week. 8 routes the week before. 10 routes in week 2. 9 routes in week 1. Week 1. He was targeted twice in week 1, 3 times in week 3. Caught 1 of 3 for 6 yards in week 3. Caught 2 of 2 for 14 yards in week 1. We're not dealing with a very frequently targeted receiver, but again, a little bit of draft capital given that they took him in the 4th round. St. Brown, 50% route run rate, ran routes on 50% of their dropbacks last week. He was targeted once. Caught his 1 target for 21 yards. I guess that's a plus. Overall, it amounted to 21 total routes. Targeted on 4.8% of them. One target. Just because he's out there running routes doesn't necessarily mean that we want him. But if he is out there running routes, I think we'll throw a couple darts at him at the very least and hope that the Bears also throw a couple darts at him. If I'm running Chicago, I'm much more interested in giving those snaps, giving those routes, giving some of the targets to the kid that we drafted this year rather than a receiver that we kind of know who he is. But there's a clear snaps advantage there, if nothing else. Could be Travis says, hey, Terry, joined late, tagged you on Discord last night. You take something down with Evaldi. No, I didn't quite get there. I had a ton of Evaldi, but didn't quite get there just with the way that lineups fell. So, unfortunately not, but looked like everybody had a pretty decent night with the Evaldi take, so happy about that. Guys talking baseball in the chat. Love to see that. Matthew Patterson bet the Rangers to win it all a while ago with huge odds. It's a good bet. Don't mind that one. Especially if they get Max back. That could be interesting. Who did we not talk about? Oh, and then Villas Jones carried the ball 1 time for 10 yards, 0 targets. Ran 2 routes in week 4, ran 2 routes in week 2. That was it for the season. Was also not targeted that week. He had... Yeah, none of those targets were in the red zone. Carried the ball once in week 2. -3 yards. Carried the ball once last week for 10 yards. If that carry happens to come on the 8-yard line and he happens to get it into the end zone, I mean, we're dealing with very, very thin possibility once we get to that kind of a play. Wouldn't necessarily quibble with Velus Jones being out of a player pool. But I think I'm leaving Tyler Scott in for sure. And ESP is definitely going to be in the player pool. Going to the other side, a little bit more clear cut. Terry McLaurin, the leader, the premier, targeted on 22.2% of the routes he ran in week 4, 27.3% air yard share. No red zone targets for the season, as I mentioned before, is very strange. Went 8 for 10 last week, 86 yards. Didn't score, though. Right here. 81% of the snaps, drawing 19.8% of the targets overall, 7 targets a game. 19.1% of the targets, 6 a game going Dotson's way, 15.3%, 5 a game going Curtis Samuel's way. And then Logan Thomas, in the games that he's played, is also drawing 5 targets a game. But Diami Brown's out there running a couple routes. It's a pretty clear 1, 2, and then like 3, 4, either way you want to split that. And then just a couple shots for some of these guys. But I do think there's some value plays. Last week, Diami Brown ran 19 routes, targeted on 15.8% of them. Ran 11 routes, 9.1% targets on those routes in week 3. Ran 18 routes, 16.7% targets in those in week 2. 9 routes, 0 targets in week 1. Of course, in week 4, that 15.8% of 19 routes amounts to he caught 2 of 3 balls for 51 yards. 25 of 78 snaps. He's out there. They're going to look his way once or twice if he does something with it. That's the kind of a showdown play. You know, when you're getting this kind of a snap share, it's not terrible, especially with a guy with a 14.9 yard ADOT, a little bit of a downfield threat against a bad pass defense. You can definitely work some of that into your lineups for showdown. Again, they're giving up 8.3 yards per pass attempt, 267 yards a game, and 2.5 touchdowns a game, 7.6 yard defensive ADOT. So there's good reason to believe that some of these down-the-board receivers on the right day get that target, do something with it, and bend the slate. When we get down to Byron Pringle, he ran 9 routes in week 4, targeted on 22.2% of those, which amounts to 2 targets. He was 1 of 2 for 15 yards overall. Caught 1 of 1 targets on 5 routes run in week 2. Ran 5 routes, no targets in week 3. Jamison Crowder ran 1 route in week 3, was not targeted, and probably just shouldn't be on the board there. I'm gonna take him out of my player pool. I also recommend that you do as well. Samuel, who we kind of skipped over there. We skipped over Dotson and Samuel a little bit. Dotson, week 4, 4 of 9 for 27 yards, the only passing touchdown. And as I mentioned before, he was targeted 4 times in the red zone in week 4, which is significant when McLaurin's not getting any. Curtis Samuel was also targeted once in the red zone in week 4. So they've just been looking in other directions than McLaurin once they get in close to the end zone. 3 times inside the 10, once inside the 5 for Dotson's targets in the red zone. Overall, he's drawing a 19.1% share, a 7.6 yard ADOT, not outbreeding 2 down the field. You know, that's more McLaurin, and then when he's out there, a little bit Diami Brown. Curtis Samuel, only a 6.3 yard ADOT, drawing 15% of the targets, 5 a game. In total, he's seen 2 red zone targets. Dotson saw 4, but they all came last week. Logan Thomas has seen 2 when he's been out there. Cole Turner's been targeted 4 times in the red zone so far. Turner only ran 5 routes and saw 6 snaps on offense last week. Wasn't targeted. He ran 21 routes and was targeted 33.3% of those routes in week 3. Went 4 of 7 for 35 yards. I don't think he's going to be a focus with Logan Thomas back. That was with Thomas out. John Bates, he ran 5 routes last week. He was targeted on 1 of them. Caught it 6 yards. Ran 21 routes and was targeted on 9.5% of them in week 3. Caught 2 of 2 for 12 yards that week. In week 2, he ran 17 routes, 29.4% of the targeted on those routes, 3 of 5 for 46 yards. it's kind of mixed between those two guys. They're both very limited. They're both very much, very unlikely to do anything, probably touchdown dependent. 800, 1200, 400, 600 on DK, 5,500, 6,000 on FanDuel. A couple of darts at most, but you've got Logan Thomas back. Last week, in his return, 74% routes run per dropback. Saw 7.7% targets on those 39 routes. Wasn't targeted much. Caught all 3 of his targets for 41 yards. He had 2 targets in the red zone in week 2. Overall, 2 of 3 for a touchdown and 22 yards that week. Week 1, he was targeted 8 times. Turned it into 43 yards. No touchdowns. 28.6% targets per route run that week. 24.5% air yard share that week. So they were looking his way. Just hasn't done a ton with it yet. But I think, clearly he's more a part of this group than he is this. Whoop, that's not good. Than he is this group. 5 targets a game in the games that he's been out there. So for me, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, like I said. And then these guys down here are just kind of darts. And I didn't mean to go as far down as Jamison Crowder there. 0% Washington defense for Matthew Patterson. Yeah, I think this is not necessarily the best game to target the defenses. I do think there will be scoring, even if it's not crazy scoring. The one thing about the defenses is they are both going up against quarterbacks that each have 5 interceptions in 4 games. Howell's got the game against Buffalo where he threw 4 interceptions in 1 game. Justin Fields could throw it to the other team at any given time. He's also coughed the ball up on the ground. So there's a little bit of opportunity for the defense to do some scoring. I think what you'd be hunting for in that situation is the defensive touchdown rather than just the stout defense kept the other team in check and didn't allow any scoring kind of a game. Pope says, I think the uglier lines tonight, the greener we end up tonight. No defense or kickers at captain. I think maybe you could go kicker, but only in a few. Probably not defense at captain this week. OMG Father says, DK shamed me into not playing commie defense even before Nick Buck has died. Hopefully the fish look at the Bears 0-4 and play otherwise. So I think that's it for up and down the receiving board. We can jump into some lineup builds. Do DK first as usual. Any preferences in the captain spot? What do we want to see? Bears defensive backfield is all hurt or out. I think Howell will have time to throw to Dotson and Thomas and Gibson out of the backfield. That would be a plus for sure. Even if they're not all hurt or out. Well, I mean, they are all hurt or out, but they're also just haven't been good. Matthew Patterson wants to see Fields in the captain spot. Pope wants to see some Dotson and Howell captains and more Fields. All right. So if we're going Fields in the captain spot, I do want to get one of his receivers for sure. DJ is both expensive and super popular. He's obviously the go-to premium guy to put there. You could go Cole Kmet, but I think I'm going to go a little bit downboard, try and get different since Fields is going to be by far the most popular in the captain spot. I'll go Darnell Mooney to just kind of offset some ownership real quick. I've got 7,100 per. Let's go Robinson. Grab some talent from that side of the game. At 64, I probably can get Howell in there. 49. $47. This would be a weird way to play it. Duped 42 times. Don't like it. I was just thinking get the Washington wipeout and flex, but you have this combo up there, but I don't love how that came together. we went Dotson and Howell there. Gives us $6,000 to play with. I really got to start just putting the people who are actually playing on these lists. Give him Komet too. Leaves you 57. This is probably going to get stupid popular too, though. Curtis Samuel. Yes. Duped too many times. It's difficult to get unique with Fields up there. We went like 62. Yeah, really funky. Even that is crazy popular. If you went like now we're a little bit less duped. Leaving 6,300 on the table to get there. It's a lot of money. It's certainly, this is kind of one way to get unique in showdown slates is definitely to leave a large chunk of money on the table. St. Brown's going to be out there running routes. He becomes a very critical part of this lineup, though, if you do this. Dotson's realistic. Mooney and Fields is a realistic combo with Fields in the captain spot. But this is how unique you have to start thinking in terms of differentiating a Fields captain spot to like anything viable. Let's say we swap out. Obviously we could swap out for like anything. Can we get that high? Yeah, you could swap out to DJ Moore, and that's actually not bad. Only dupe 7 times. That's playable. Leaves 300 on the table. I would wager that goes up. That's a little bit more duped. But that's not completely awful for having Fields at the captain spot. What was everybody else asking for? Dotson and a Howell. Let's do Dotson. So if I go Dotson there, I probably do want Howell along with him for the correlated scoring. Left. Kind of a Washington wipeout. 33 times. That's no good. Komet's too popular. Another way to do the Washington wipeout. 25 dupes, though. Don't love that, especially with the second and third wide receivers from that offense, and you're just kind of hoping that McLaurin still doesn't get in the end zone. I don't like it since it's duped that many times. What if we went to, instead of Herbert, you can go funky like that. And then we've got 97. 19 times. Yeah, that's Robinson was too popular a play. So what if we went Robinson instead of McLaurin? Gives us 10-7. Still can't get Fields. It's an interesting one. Just the way that it's the way that it comes together. Like going both of the secondary running backs so that we can get Fields in there. That leaves a ton of money on the table. We could probably replace the Commanders with a do that. That leaves 900 on the table. We're still duped 26 times. Son of a bitch. this. 7,300. 44 times. Shit. Challenging. I'm going to go all skill players. Oh, I had Dotson in there twice. I didn't realize that. So you can't use that lineup anyway. $92. You got Herbert in there already. Even that weird one. Dupe 13 times, leaves 2,900 on the table. Primary skill players across the board, no quarterbacks. It's a weird one. I think you want at least one of the quarterbacks in here. What if you replace Moore with Fields? 23 times. Jeez. Challenging slate to get unique on DK here. You could go, I mean, you can just grab one of these guys and you pop him in there, and then all of a sudden you're down to 2, but you've kind of constricted that lineup's upside a little bit. Becomes very touchdown dependent again around ESB here. Like Diane Brown, same thing. You still duped a few times. There are options for that, as we looked at. Where's what's his face? There he is. That's one way to get funky. Obviously, I don't think we would leave it exactly like this. You could go Dotson, Robinson, Fields. Could probably get Sam Howell into this one. And nope. No. I was duped 5 times. At least 4,100 on the table. A lot of different directions to go with this shit. That's for sure. A bit of a Falcons talk in the chat. Talking Desmond Ridder. Mama says, I don't know how the hell Howell is still walking after being sacked 24 times in 4 games. Jesus. Yeah, there's a little bit of upside for some defense. They were getting, what was the pressure rate that we saw? 30% pressure rate will be facing. Blitzing 30% of the time. They've got 12 sacks on the season. Could be a little bit of defensive upside there. Howell with his kicker, and Fields see what's left to build. Alrighty. We can do that. So Howell, Sly is their kicker. Fields. Leaves you 6,900 per. It's not bad. You grab like Dotson in there. Correlate with Howell. I greatly prefer Herbert there, but it's going to be much more popular if you go this route. 51, and then you could go like Mooney. That's 48 times duped. What if we went with Johnson instead? That one's 26 times. Not great. You could obviously spend more than Mooney there. You can go to, oops. If I get Herbert and Johnson, that would be a weird way to do it. Even that is duped. And, you know, these dupe numbers, obviously, it's using the raw ownership product, so it doesn't necessarily account for, like, people who would just naturally not want both the running backs or whatever. But it's a rough estimate. So that's not great. Yeah, a lot of these to get truly unique, you got to get a little bit silly with some of these on this slate, the way that it's coming together. Not that Logan Thomas, the player I just grabbed, is silly here. You could differentiate a little bit too, and another one that's not necessarily going to be completely reflected in going to like the opposing defense, even with the quarterback captain. You hope that they get to him a handful of times, put up an okay score for the money at 44,000. Not a great way to go about it, in my opinion. Semi-viable. And then it's just like give him DJ Moore. That's 20 times. 1,000. You can go to 55. You could use the Commanders in the same idea. 30. Give Sam Howell his defense. Challenging slate. A lot of playable parts. Again, it's going to come down to, potentially anyway, lineup construction wise anyway, it's going to come down to some of these downboard guys who might get a couple of looks. Every time we put Equinemius in there, he had a pretty big impact on those numbers. Put him in for like a lower owned guy like, whoops. And obviously you've got the super cheap option in Scott. Some different directions to go, that's for sure. FanDuel side, real quick. Nobody really cares that much about FanDuel lineups, and we do have to punch out and get some lineups built for this thing. But we'll do a couple quick ones, or a quick one. Dotson in the MVP. Howell. Can we get Fields in there too? Sure we can. 9,200 per. This is easy. $11.5. Oh, you're so generous, FanDuel. This is going to be way too duped. Yeah, 26 times. Just so much salary available, though. Instead of doing that, though, you could go like Johnson. We have a bunch of money on the table. Cut down to 11 dupes. And then maybe instead of Logan Thomas, you could say Cole Kmet. It's 11 dupes also. Gives Justin Fields something to work with. DJ, I think, is too expensive here. Yeah, we got to go cheaper there. So you give DJ to Fields. You've got Jahan Dotson working with Sam Howell in the top spot, and then you've got $6,000 to spend on this this rando spot. So we go right to ESB and take it down to 3 dupes. The rest of these guys are more in the only going to run a couple of routes. This is the most likely cheap guy to run some routes. Whether or not they target him is another story. On FanDuel, Tyler Scott, $6,500 versus ESB at the $6,000 price. You go like Commanders D, $9,500. They're a little pricey. And then obviously you're not going with DJ. So you could say like Fields on his own, likely to score anyway. But the Commanders D, maybe they pick him off, take a pick 6 back. And then you've got 9,000 here. So you could go like the kicker. 28 times duped. I don't love that. Gibson. Go down board a little bit. 20 times duped. Not great. Is Commander's D going to be popular on FanDuel? Apparently so. Not my numbers. I'm not going to leave them up on the screen. Yeah, I guess Commander's D on FanDuel might be a little bit popular even at that price tag. I don't necessarily love that. Let's go a different route here. Let's say we want to do give it a Khalil Herbert. Could happen. Oh, on the other side. Actually, you know what? Instead of that, let's make it a ground-oriented game. Turn this on its head a little bit. And that's a unique lineup. Duped 5 times. Herbert, Robinson, Commanders, Kmet, and Santos. Don't love that one. Pretty big projection difference. DJ MVP. I think you want Fields with him. There you go, Robinson. And this will get you unique. 10,000. Can I still afford Howell? I can't. But I can get Met. That's not terrible. Become dependent on Diami getting a couple targets. But everybody else in that lineup's fairly believable. Projected out significantly higher than that other one I just built a minute ago. Kind of just throwing some stuff at the wall here. I don't think that's terrible. Who else do we have in the 65 range? You could go to the Tyler Scott option. You're kind of loading up on that side now, though. Let's dupe twice. ESB, obviously. Johnson instead there, and then go Dotson. That's 22 times already. It's Mooney. 12 times. That's more dupes than I would want. That one's like borderline. 500 to spend. You could grab somebody other than Johnson, maybe. Like the Bears D, I guess. Gibson instead of Johnson into that one. Probably lowers it a little bit, yeah. A lot of interesting ways to put it together. Easier on FanDuel this week for sure. Typically is without the multiplier. OMG Father says you don't want Diami Brown and seems pretty enthusiastic about it. You're at 19 routes. Was targeted on 15.8% of them. Week 4. It's only a handful of targets, obviously. Two of 3 targets, 51 yards in week 4. Yeah, not a strong option. Somebody who's not necessarily even going to get targeted for sure. Mama's playing both defenses in 40% of his lineups. Okay. That's one way to go. Bears plus 7 for 50 grand. Whew. That is one way to go. All right, guys. With that in mind, it is 7:30 and this game starts in 45 minutes or less. So I got to go get some lineups built. I'm going to say thank you very much. I'm going to say goodnight. Hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button. Come on back tomorrow. We'll have projections up tonight. For the main slate, we'll do a little quarterbacks and stacks tomorrow. And that's about it. Good luck out there. Somebody go win something. As somebody said at the beginning of the show, somebody go out there and win something big tonight. It's time. Time for somebody to win something big. Good luck out there, gang. I'll see you tomorrow.